then Secretary of the Treasury, and his mentor Morris pushed in a new bill through legislation for another privately owned bank. This new bank was called First Bank of U.S. Thomas willingly served as president, obviously. The players in this fraudulent scheme against all the peoples of Turtle Island remained the same. The only thing that was changed here was the name of the bank. Next walks the Constitutional Convention. 1787, colonial leaders assembled themselves to replace the Articles of Confederation. Both Thomas Jefferson and James Madison remained steadfastly unmoved towards a privately owned bank. They didn't want it. They had seen the problems, of course, that devastated England, Europe, and a little bit of history here would have shown how that same scheme has devastated everywhere it's hit throughout history. During the debate over future monetary system, another one of the founding fathers, Governor Morris, basically killed all the motivations of the owners of the Bank of America. Morris was the head of a committee that wrote the final draft of the Constitution. This is when the Constitution was no longer what it originally was. And by the way, you had one before this. You did. You had the Articles of Confederation, which were the original Iroquois. This filth that was brought in was something completely different. Morris knew the motivations of the bank here. His old boss, Robert Morris and Alexander Hamilton, were the ones who presented the original plan, Bank of North America, to the Constitutional Congress during the last year of the Revolution. The rich will strive to establish their dominion and enslave the rest. They always do. They always will. They will have the same effect here as elsewhere if we do not, by the power of the government, keep the proper spheres in place. And that was written by James Madison. Morris, and it was mostly by deflection, of course, from the ranks of banks, Hamilton, Robert Morris, Thomas Willing, and their government, European bankers, didn't throw in the towel. They convinced the delegates at this convention not to give Congress the power to issue money. Most of the delegates were still aware of paper currency problems that arose during the insurance of paper currency during the Revolution. They had apparently forgotten how well the paper script had worked prior to war for 300 years. The Bank of England won, basically. So the Constitution remained silent on this matter, where it was going to be written in. This deflect left the door open for everything that came back, the money changers, just as was planned from the beginning. Just as happens everywhere, eventually, by this same idea, right? It was only 3 years after the signing of this new Constitution, this newly appointed first Secretary of the Treasury proposed a bill calling for the new privately owned central bank. And he was the one that said, "Let me issue and control a nation's money, and I do not care who writes the laws." The very same year that Amschel Rothschild said that. They both said it. They both felt it. And this is how things are done. This is how the world is run. This is behind everything. Every war, every bloodshed, every takeover of insurrection, every putting of people on lists, every pollution of our soil, our water, our land, everything goes back to this. The bank had been given a monopoly, even though 80% of its stock was held in private investors, not in the United States, by the way. The other 20% was then purchased by the U.S. government. The reason was not to give a government a piece of the profits. It was a scheme to provide cash needed for the other 89% owners. The old Bank of America and the Bank of England, the stockholders never paid the full amount of their shares, ever. And the Royal Bank of Canada, that was brought in at the very same time. The RBC Bank, exact same guys, owned by the exact same people. By the way, it's a Canadian from, and this is the first time it's ever happened, by the way, is now in charge at the Bank of England. The U.S. government put up the private shareholders' initial $2 million in cash. Okay, let me read that again. The U.S. government put up the private shareholders' initial $2 million in cash. That means it was the American people paying the American government for the American government to pay these guys. And then through fractional reserves made loans to its charter investors so they could come up with the remaining $8 million needed for the risk-free investment. Of course it was risk-free to the 89% who hadn't paid for anything. You're getting that, right? They paid for nothing. Ah, we have a question. Yes, this is from the Scottish sites. Hey guys. Okay, Gary passed this along. Does Tracy think that going back to gold standard would be good for original people? As for a referendum, how do we know that it will not be fixed? Is Scotland aware of the geoengineering is really doing? Dumbing down through now suggested form through vibration, crystals, plants, etc. Well, do I think the gold standard or the silver standard work? No. When we had true fiat currency, when your boy in England, and I'm sorry, he was not a boy, he was a king, but when he had a tally stick, which he divided in half and said, this stick represents this amount of money. Even if that stick was stolen, you could go back to the treasury at the time, and however much was left was still there. You couldn't defraud it, for instance. So, no, I think that the gold-based standard, because of the way that it's been played back and forth, will never be kept honest. Because it never has been. If I could see it being used once in a way that actually worked for common people, I'd say, yeah, let's do it. But as far as I could tell, it's never really worked. As for the frequency and the dumbing down and the... We'll get to that. I know I said it a little bit yesterday, but there's a reason why they're doing this to us too. To keep us sick and slow, so we can't concentrate when we get somebody who screams like say an Alex Jones, right? Like an Alex Jones, someone who screams to us. We have a tendency to want to believe it, rather than going over the facts of what really has worked for our people. And I don't mean just like natives or black people or one way. I mean all of our people. These gold standards had always been messed with. as far back in history as we can tell. So no, I don't ever see it working. Now, name of the bank was deliberately chosen. Just like all names that are changed are deliberately chosen because they've given it some thought here. Like Gary was saying yesterday, you don't change a name without giving it a lot of thought. Now, there was chosen to hide the fact that it was completely privately owned. Just like Bank of England, that sounds like it's for the English people, British people, Commonwealth. It's not. The names of the private investors were never fully revealed. However, it's well known that the Rothschilds were doing a driving power here. The Bank of England, just like the Bank of the United States. Same guys. The bank was sold as a way to stabilize the nation's currency and to control inflation. But before they had this gold back standard thing, it was stable. The United States was doing well. There was actually some peace going on between tribes. That changed. Over the first 5 years, United States government borrowed $8.5 million from the Bank of the United States. And over the same 5-year period, prices rose 72%. Jefferson, as Secretary of State, watched the borrowing with sadness and frustration and was unable to stop it. Millions of Americans and people all over this world feel the same way today, just as helpless, and they watch Congress borrow the U.S. economy completely into oblivion, just like all the economies of the whole world are being borrowed into oblivion. And thank you guys for that question, and I hope that was a good answer. And we will, of course, talk about that kind of stuff too as we go on. Now, Napoleon. Let's go back. Bank of France, organized 1800s, exactly the same premise here. Bank of England, Bank of the United States, Bank of Canada. Of course, Royal Bank of Canada. Stick a royal in front of any big bank, and we know where it comes from. A couple places. De Rothschild, England, Vatican. We'll go more into that as the week proceeds. Now, Napoleon decided France had to break free of debt, and he never trusted the Bank of France. He declared, when the government relied on the bankers for money, the bankers, not the political leaders, were in control of the government. The hand that gives is above the hand that takes. Money has no motherland. Financiers without patriotism and without decency, their sole object is gain. Which is why, when he was declared ruler, kind of thing, he would not allow the Vatican to place the crown on his head. Because up until then it was the Vatican who said who could marry, who could divorce, who could be king, who would not be king, even though Henry VIII had gone against that. They still had the power at this time. But that changed, or at least almost changed, with Napoleon. Now back in the States, we have Thomas Jefferson narrowly defeating James Adams to become the third president of the United States. Not officially the third president either. There was actually 8 more before the guys account, but we'll talk about that, because you had a working constitution, by the way. You had one, and it was doing fine. Anyway, by 1803, Jefferson and Napoleon had a deal. The U.S. would give Napoleon $3 million in gold in exchange for a huge piece of land west